What's happening, everybody? So, Dick Meyer posted up a really good question. So, Dick, this video is for you. Basically, the question is what are some do's and don'ts when it comes to modifying the Hemi? Well, I'm going to speak on this more or less from the owner of a 6.4 liter, but I know plenty of guys with 5.7s, and I know some work that they've done and what kind of results they've been able to yield from their work. Now, what I want to talk about is basically what kind of gains you can expect and what kind of money you can expect to spend. And really, I don't want to get into the whole, which mod is better, like which intake is better, what cam is better, what exhaust is better. I just want to kind of walk you guys through some things that I found that were basically useless and some things that I found that work really well just in terms of getting power out of these engines. The key thing I want to do is I want to throw one quick thing out there, and that is to say that no modification has gained any real big power gains so far as I can see. At least not with the 6.4. But talking about the 5.7, it's a horse of a different color. So let's start at the beginning where most people start off, and that's going to be with some kind of a cold air intake. Guys, listen, it kills me to see folks spend a ton of money on a cold air intake only to yield very little result. My testing with that leg maker that might have rubbed some folks the wrong way. Yeah, it didn't pick up a lot of power and it didn't really gain anything at the drag strip where it's touted to really work well. But what it did do very well is it led to a very consistent drop in intake air temperatures. Basically, it picked up a little bit of consistency at the drag strip. So yeah, there's something to be said for that, but in real-world application, when you're doing real-world testing, I just didn't really live up to the promise. But because it looks cool and because it does lend itself to a bit more of a consistent series of passes, it gets a thumbs up. So yes, definitely if it's something that you want to pursue with the cold air intake, if you're going for just a look, yeah, go for it. But if you're doing it because you're looking for a specific gain, not necessarily a cost-effective modification, at least not when you compare it to a basic drop-in filter with your stock air box. It'll yield about the same results and cost a fraction of what any of those cold air intakes will run you. So next is going to be throttle body spacers, things like that. And that's going to tie into intake manifold stuff. Look, first of all, ported throttle bodies, any type of a throttle body on these cars, you're not going to see much of a gain. This is a modification that's really more suited to guys that have gone to much larger displacements. Guys that have gone from, a 5.7 to maybe a 408 stroker type of a build. In that case, yeah, you'll see a bit of a gain. But for a normal guy, even with a 6.4, I just can't see there being too much of a gain to be found. And we're talking 3 to 5 horsepower at the most on a fairly normal or at least streetable build. Now, getting into like spacers, don't waste your time or money. But when you're talking about intake manifolds, that's a little bit different. So here's the thing with that. I found that when I did my porting on the intake manifold, I didn't go in and, take out a whole bunch of material. Basically, I did what's known as a cleanup. And what that means is I'm just removing any casting flash from inside of those runners. Fairly common thing with composite intakes. LS's, if you've got one, you know what I'm talking about if you've done any mods to that. But even with that, it didn't yield too much of a gain in power. Again, I am running the stock throttle body, but since it's been proven that there's not much of a gain to be found with that stock, a modified throttle body over the stock, I've got to assume that unless I went with an aftermarket intake, meaning the Edelbrock, which I don't think has even been released yet, or a ported 6.1 intake, I'm not looking to have too many gains. In fact, if you've got a 6.4 and you've got the dual runner length intake manifold, you're not going to see too much of a gain really at all because you've got the best of both worlds and the ports are fairly large on those intake manifolds. Again, the aftermarket's going to have to really do a good job to best that 6.4 intake. yeah, you might see some claims of 15 to 25 horsepower. I'm not so sure that I'm on board with that just yet. I'd love to test that theory, or at least test the part to put the theory to the test in terms of, is a variable runner intake better at making horsepower than a ported 6.1 style of intake or aftermarket intake that is using that style? But unfortunately, there's no real way to test it because, number one, the Edelbrock's not out. Number two, the cost of the thing is ridiculous. If you've ever priced a ported intake manifold for a 6.1, your jaw's going to drop. It is absolutely asinine for me to spend that kind of money on a part with absolutely no real promise of gains. At any rate, long story short, I know I'm getting away from the point. Stick with the stock manifold. You can send it off to MMR. I think there's a couple other places that will do some porting on that intake, at least give it a nice cleanup to where you're flowing basically engineered numbers. What you're doing basically at that point is you're just trying to match the intake for what the engineers had designed the flow and the dynamics to basically work around. You're blueprinting the intake, so to speak. That's about as far as I would take it. Now, going from the intake manifold down through the engine camshafts, look, sky's the limit. Everybody's got their own take on this. I'm a bit of a fan of the Comp 270, but there's like 5 or 6 other camshafts out there that are off the shelf, not custom grind, that would probably yield a pretty decent result. But keep a few things in mind. Your stock Hemi camshaft is really kind of no slouch from the factory. If you've got an earlier 5.7, I think even up through today, your lift is around 470, with the 6.4s checking in at around 570 for intake and about 540 for your exhaust. So the lift number is pretty much there. There's just a lack of duration. Stock Hemi cam is going to be somewhere around the 200-ish range at 54. And when I say at 50, it's just racer speak. It's at 0.50 inches of lift. In other words, just as the lifter is coming up on that ramp, that's where you would start that measurement. It's just something that a lot of guys use, kind of make reading cam cards a little bit easier. But anyway, getting away from the point, the cam's not too bad. You could stand to go with a bit more duration, but you know, the days of being able to throw a cam in one of these cars or in an engine just to speak of, over the stock cam pick up 60, 70 horsepower, pretty much not going to happen. Camshaft, yeah, it's kind of worth it, especially if you're already tearing the thing apart, but if you're just doing some minor things to the car and you're not really expecting to do a whole lot more with the car than just have fun with it, leave the stock camshaft in there. You should be good to go. The only difference I would say with that is if you're going to go into the engine to do any work to it, if you've got a car with the multi-displacement system and you're starting to run into problems with the lifters, which by the way is a universal thing. If it's Dodge, Ford, anybody that's using an MDS system, that's where it kills cylinders while you're cruising down the freeway. Those lifters, they're just heavier, they're prone to breaking, and they don't just shatter or anything like that. They'll typically give you quite a bit of warning because they'll start making some racket. If you're going in to replace those with the non-MDS lifters, and that's if you've got a tune to support it, by the way, because you can't do that mod without the tune, you might want to throw in a different cam at that point, but the reality is you're just not going to see a ton. Typically around 25 to 30 at the wheels at the most with a solid tune. So from there, cylinder heads, you know, they do make a higher ratio rocker arm setup for the cars. I think Arrington carries it if I'm not mistaken. But, you know, the reality is, again, the expense. You're going to go from a 165 ratio to a 170. You're not going to be picking up too much there. But at any rate, that's available if you're doing a build. Normally, you know what? Normally, I would throw a set of 1.7s. I mean, every Ford I've ever owned has had 1.7s on it in terms of the roller rockers. Because they're inexpensive, it's an easy mod to do. It's not that the modification is hard on a Hemi. In fact, it's fairly simple. But the problem is the damn things cost a fortune. I mean, they're like $1,600 or $1,800 for the set. Fuck that. I mean, really? That's ridiculous. And if you haven't noticed, there's going to be a bit of a theme going on here, and it's going to be just the sheer expense of doing a modification or a series of modifications to the Hemi to yield any real power. And really, for a set of rockers that you might pick up 10 horsepower with, it's just not worth spending $1,600. So yeah, bring that cost down a little bit. Even $450, I might be on board, and there's no guarantee to pick up power. Anyway, I'm getting away from it again. I'm just here to tell you, yeah, I just wouldn't necessarily go that route. Exhaust, look, shorty headers, a lot of companies sell them. Anything's better than your cast iron manifolds. They're worth a solid 5 to 7 horsepower. Just do it. It's good practice, if nothing else, and it'll keep you involved with the car. Long tubes, on the other hand, I know a lot of guys are getting some really good results with them. I'm just not 100% on board with them yet, although if anybody's got a set they want to send me, I'd love to do an A-B comparison between the clamshell shorties on my 6.4 and a set of 1 3/4 inch long tubes. I just think that'd be neat, and it'd be fun to see the differences between the two. I think that I would be surprised at just how little it does pick up. Even with a solid tune, I think it'd pick up a little bit in torque, but horsepower would be about the same. So there's those mods in a nutshell. Just as far as what I have seen work, well, so far as I can tell, if you're chasing numbers, removing catalytic converters doesn't really do a whole lot in terms of picking up power. In fact, I think my car maybe picked up 7 foot-pounds of torque with a 0 horsepower gain by removing the catalytic converters. So keep it green, leave your cats on there. You're not going to notice any real difference in terms of power. But last but not least, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, the tune. Look, guys, it's funny when folks are asking about tunes on these cars. It's interesting just how much power you don't pick up from a tune. You'll pick up some power down low. You'll pick up some better drivability with some, removal of the torque management. But the reality is that the cars are already a little bit under-tuned, but not by much. You're looking at just a handful of degrees in terms of, in other words, 2 or 3 degrees difference between stock and a tune to really get the car into a good, safe zone that is not only going to yield a little bit more power, say 10 more horsepower, but also not be, sensitive to fuel quality. That's really the trick, is to put together a tune that is not only going to be user-friendly, but it's not going to put the car at risk and put the performance of the car at risk by having the computer yank a ton of timing because it's picking up knock because of fuel quality. You got to remember, the Hemis are more of a tumble port design, which means that, they're just not as efficient as, say, a good wedge design, and that basically lends itself to the car being a bit more sensitive to knock. That's about it. They do bring in a ton of air, though, so they're going to need a lot of fuel. These Hemis do like to run a little bit on the rich side at wide open throttle. Just remember that when you're putting a tune together, or when you're, doing some data logging. You might see some figures that if you're used to Fords or Chevrolets are a little bit off, such as timing being fairly low for the power that you're making, or fuel mixtures being fairly rich for the power that you're making. That's just how the Hemis are. That's what they like. So that's how you tune them. So at any rate, I hope this helped out a little bit. I didn't really want to get into power adders, but okay, I'll get into power adders. Nitrous, look, anytime you're playing with nitrous, a good solid nitrous tune is necessary, but I just wouldn't go above 150 shot. That's just my preference. It's what I'm comfortable with. Superchargers, look, there's several kits out there. Follow their recommendations. The car will make a ton of power. You'll have a lot of fun with it. And at that point, exhaust mods are going to be a bit more important. Don't worry too much about intake manifolds at that point, because you've got a compressor filling that thing full of pressurized air. So, but at any rate, I hope that helps you out. Hope that answered a couple of questions. Leave your comments below. Hope y'all having a great one. That's a wrap. Adios.